deceptive than that. Now, you notice that the Antichrist and Judas bear the same name. So let's study the character of Judas to see if we can discover what the character of the Antichrist is. The first thing that we want to notice about Judas Iscariot is that he was a shrewd politician and a sharp businessman who carried the money bag and craved the praise of people. I want to read you some statements from the Spirit of Prophecy. First, in the book of Education, page 93. She's speaking about Judas. He had come more into contact with the world than they, that is, than the disciples. He was a man, this is according to his own estimation, he was a man of good address, of discernment, and executive ability, and having a high estimate of his own qualifications. He had led the disciples to hold him in the same regard. But the methods he desired to introduce into Christ's work were based upon worldly principles and were controlled by worldly policy. Would you say that that would be true of the way that the Vatican operates? Absolutely. In Bible Commentary, Volume 5, pages 1101 and 1102, Ellen White further describes what Judas was like. But Judas was a speculator. He thought that he could manage the finances of the church, and by his sharpness in business, get gain. He was divided in heart. He loved the praise of the world. He refused to give up the world for Christ. He never committed his eternal interest to Christ. He had a superficial religion, and therefore he speculated upon his master and betrayed him to the priests, being fully persuaded that Christ would not allow himself to be taken. Judas was a religious fraud. He held up a high standard for others, but he himself utterly failed to reach the Bible standard. He did not bring the religion of Christ into his life. What an interesting description. Finally, in Desire of Ages, page 717, Ellen White wrote, Judas summed up all the disciples and flattered himself that the church often would be brought into perplexity and embarrassment if it were not for his ability as a manager. Judas regarded himself as a capable one who could not be overreached. In his own estimation, he was an honor to the cause, and as such, he always represented himself. So that's the first picture that we get of the character of Judas. Now, Judas also coveted an earthly kingdom. He wasn't thinking, about the spiritual kingdom that Jesus wanted to establish. No. He wanted an earthly kingdom where the Romans would be destroyed and Jesus would take over the reins of civil power. In John chapter 6 and verse 15, we have the feeding of the 5,000. After Jesus fed the 5,000, the multitude wanted to take Jesus and make him king. Let's read John chapter 6 and verse 15, and then we're going to look at who the ringleader of this was. It says, Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, who came up with the idea? Who spearheaded this idea of taking Jesus and making him a political king? It was Judas. Desire of Ages, page 718 and 719, Ellen White wrote, Judas was first to take advantage of the enthusiasm excited by the miracle of the loaves. It was he who set on foot the project to take Christ by force and make him king. His hopes were high. His disappointment was bitter. In another statement that we find in Desire of Ages 7:18 and 7:19, Ellen White wrote, Notwithstanding the Savior's own teaching, Judas was continually advancing the idea that Christ would reign as king in Jerusalem. At the feeding of the 5,000, he tried to bring this about. And when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples in the upper room, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. In Desire of Ages 645, Ellen White describes how Judas, when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, thought, this cannot be the King of Israel. Humble himself to wash the feet of his own disciples, he can't be the Messiah. Notice Desire of Ages, page 645. If Jesus could so humble himself, he thought, he could not be Israel's king. All hope of worldly honor in a temporal kingdom was destroyed. Judas was satisfied that there was nothing to be gained by following Christ. After seeing him degrade himself, as he thought, he was confirmed in his purpose to disown him and confess himself deceived. He was possessed by a demon, and he resolved to complete the work he had agreed to do in betraying his Lord. So he wanted a temporal kingdom. Let me ask you, does the papacy want a temporal kingdom, a political kingdom on earth? Let me ask you this. How many times have you heard Francis I talk about the second coming of Jesus Christ? Never. Because the goal of the papacy is not a kingdom established supernaturally by Jesus, but to take over the political powers of the world to establish the theocracy that they had during the 1260 years. The church dominating the state, dominating society. That's the Roman Catholic ideal all the time since the days of St. Augustine. So you would not expect the papacy to tell people that we have this blessed hope, the glorious second coming of Jesus Christ. Judas also coveted money and feigned a love for the poor. Does Francis I talk a lot about helping the poor? Does he visit hospitals, the sick, and so on? People say, this is wonderful. This is the most wonderful thing since peanut butter was invented. I'm being sarcastic in case you didn't notice. Notice Matthew 8, 19 to 21. Matthew 8, 19 to 21. When Jesus first met Judas, he did not call Judas. Judas offered his services. And I want you to notice the story in Matthew 8, 19 to 21. There was a certain scribe came to him and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If you're thinking that you're going to join me because you're going to have political power and you're going to have money, think again. John 12, verses 4 through 6. John 12, 4 through 6. Once again, we see that Judas coveted political power. It says here, and that he feigned a love for the poor. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, this is when the woman, anointed the feet of Jesus with that precious perfume. Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? See, he really cared for the poor, didn't he? Verse 6. This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used it to take what was put in it. In Luke 22, verses 3 through 6, we notice that Judas sold Jesus for money. He was money hungry. Let me ask you, is that true of the papacy as well? They feign love for the poor and they fleece people from their money? Absolutely. Luke 22, verses 3 through 6. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. Ellen White in Desire of Ages, page 716, wrote the following. Judas had naturally a strong love for money, but he had not always been corrupt enough to do such a deed as this, that is, to sell Jesus for money. He had fostered the evil spirit of avarice until it had become the ruling motive of his life. The love of mammon overbalanced his love for Christ. Through becoming the slave of one vice, he gave himself to Satan to be driven to any lengths in sin. In fact, you know something interesting? Judas became the vicar of Satan. Really? The representative of Satan? An individual who claimed to be faithful to Jesus and be fighting for Jesus and be loyal to Jesus? Notice John 6, 70 and 71. After the feeding of the 5,000, when Judas was the ringleader in trying to force Jesus to become king, at the end of the chapter we find who was the ringleader. It says in John 6, 70 and 71, Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil?" He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. And yet Judas, even though Jesus said he is a devil, and actually we're going to notice that he became demon-possessed at the end of his life, he claimed to serve Christ and be loyal to Christ. He feigned support. And yet at the same time, he was secretly undermining Jesus. Notice John chapter 13 and verse 2. And supper being ended, the devil, having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Notice John chapter 13, verse 27. Now after the piece of bread, notice, after Jesus gives Judas a piece of bread and he says, "To whom I'm giving this piece of bread?" He's the betrayer. It says, now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." It's interesting to read Ellen White's remark about Satan entering him. In Desire of Ages, page 295, she wrote, Judas became a representative of the enemy of Christ. He became the vicar, which is what the word vicar means, representative. He was not the representative of Jesus. He was the representative of the evil one, of the enemy of Christ. And yet, Judas's hypocrisy fooled even the disciples. He worked underground by subterfuge. He did not reveal his true character. He was concealed. He worked at cross purposes with Jesus, claiming to support him, but underneath, he was working to undermine the authority of Christ. He had the appearance of the chameleon. He did not openly war against Jesus, but Ellen White tells us in Education, page 92, that he manifested a continuous, secret, and subtle antagonism towards Christ. In the book, The Sanctified Life, page 59, Ellen White wrote, Judas possessed a form of godliness. See, all the forms were there. He appeared to be religious. He appeared to be a supporter of Christ. Judas possessed a form of godliness while his character was more satanic than divine. He professed to be a disciple of Christ, but in his words and works denied him. You know, it's very interesting that when the disciples and Jesus were sitting there at the table in the upper room, Ellen White tells us that Judas was sitting to the left side of Christ. That's significant, because in the Bible, frequently, the left side is the side of God's disfavor. Where did Jesus place the goats? On the left side, right? On the left side. By the way, in Spanish, the left side is called siniestra. In English, the word is sinister. The left side is the sinister side. Do you know what sinister means? Also, I don't know if this happens in English, we say that he got up on the wrong foot. Hispanics say he got up on the left foot. and so the left in the Bible frequently means the side of God's disfavor. On the other hand, on the right side of Jesus was the beloved disciple John, who in the course of time reflected the character of Jesus Christ. In Desire of Ages 644, Ellen White wrote, Judas pressed next to Christ on the left side. John was on the right. If there was a highest place, Judas was determined to have it. And that place was thought to be next to Christ. And Judas was a traitor. In Matthew 26 and verse 25, We find that Judas had the disciples, the very disciples, deceived till the very end. He had the first church members deceived till the very end. They thought that he was an asset to the work of God. Notice Matthew chapter 26 and verse 25. This is when Jesus says, one of the disciples is going to betray me. One of you. Oh, each one of them says, is it I? Is it I? Notice what Judas said, Matthew 26, 25. Then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? He said to him, you have said it. And even then, the disciples didn't realize what Jesus was saying. Notice John 13, verses 26 to 29. He had a form of godliness, and he deceived his own colleagues. We find in John 13, verse 26, Jesus answered, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. In other words, to whoever I get the piece of bread, disciples, you can know that he's the betrayer. Notice, and having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. You would have thought that the disciples would say, oh, he's the one. No. Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Ellen White says that the disciples thought that Jesus was sending Judas on an errand. Verse 28, but no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. They totally missed the point. He had his fellow leaders deceived till the very end. By the way, how did Judas betray Jesus? With a kiss. What worse way could you have of betraying the master than with a kiss? We find in Luke 22, verses 47 and 48. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? You all know what eventually happened with Judas. He is called the son of perdition because his final end was perdition. He was lost. Notice Matthew 27, verses 3 to 5. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. By the way, it was not the intention of Judas to betray Jesus so that Jesus would be crucified. He was hoping to put Jesus under pressure so that Jesus would release himself and he would take the throne. He would destroy those who were oppressing him. But his plan backfired. And that's why he hanged himself. You know, if he was expecting Jesus to die, when he saw that they were killing Jesus, he would have said, oh, good, my plan worked. But when his plan backfired, he went and he hanged himself. And by the way, the book of Acts seems to have a different perspective of what happened to Judas at the end. It says that he fell a distance and his belly exploded and his innards came out. And so some scholars, liberal scholars say, see, the Bible contradicts itself, because one place it says that he hanged himself and the other place it says that he fell a distance and his belly split open. Well, Ellen White explains it very clearly. She says Judas was the heaviest of all of the disciples. There was a branch hanging over a ledge. He put the rope around the branch, and because he was very heavy, the branch broke. The rope that held him to the branch broke, and he fell a long distance, and his belly split open. He committed suicide. But, he expected to hang himself, but in the process of hanging himself, he fell this distance, and that's what happened to him. So let's review the characteristics of Judas. A shrewd politician and a sharp administrator. Coveted political power and desired Christ to set up an earthly kingdom. Was covetous of money and earthly display. Feigned an interest for the poor. He became the representative of Satan. His hypocrisy deceived even those who were part of the inner circle. He betrayed Jesus with a kiss, even though he professed to be his follower. He was an enemy from the inside who feigned love for Jesus. That is the characteristic of the Antichrist. Now let's go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter